My presentation is called From Quarks to Qualia, and the topic of tonight's debate is, can metaphysical naturalism account for qualia? So I have to lay out a few definitions since maybe we're not all familiar with the terms. Metaphysical naturalism is the belief that the physical world is all that there is, or at least all that we currently know of. And some go on to define it as disbelief in any irreducible mental substances that supposedly make up minds, gods, or magical things. Qualia is sense experience. It is the immediate, apparently irreducible impression of anything as it occurs to you in your mind. From the color red, to memories, to thoughts and feelings, philosophers call that qualia. Various versions of supernaturalism obviously accept the existence of the physical world we can all see and interact with, and then they claim there's something more to it. Or in this case, we're literally arguing over the exact nature of a particular part of that common ground. And as I understand it, many religious philosophers hope to claim your very thoughts for their supernatural worldview in more ways than one. So the debate could have been, what is qualia? Or which worldview best accounts for qualia? Or even, can supernaturalism account for qualia? However, in religious philosophical culture, it's a bit of a popular go-to argument when evidence of miracles or other magical things is not very forthcoming. Often this Trojan horse of sorts is wheeled across the battlefield, hoping to show that something like qualia is actually a non-physical thing right there in front of us, so to speak, so that our very thoughts are uncaused agents, like their first cause immaterial God is supposed to be like. And I would agree this would be great proof of concept for theism if qualia is what they say it is. And if just one thing can be shown to not be physical, all versions of naturalism are by definition false. So this is an important debate, even if it does not necessarily help us sort out any particular supernatural worldview. As I turn the page. To be clear, I believe qualia exists. I understand that some physicalists want to quibble over semantics, but I'm fine with labeling something as long as we're allowed to understand how it actually is, despite appearances. Qualia is a word, and we're talking about sense experience, which we obviously have, so that's really all I mean by that. And I believe that qualia is the language of the mind. The nomenclature of consciousness is a sophisticated form of physical computation by a biological brain that is almost unrecognizable by those very computational processes, i.e. us. Because those processes do not involve processing things from the atoms up. You don't see atoms in your consciousness, you see thoughts. The world of sense experience is an artificial theater created by the brain to organize tons of abstract information that is constantly streaming in from the sense organs, including the information generated by the brain's own picture of itself, by the way, into one mostly coherent functional whole. For example, we don't see the frequency of light waves. We see what we call color. And say you are colorblind, you see a different version of color. But that's still not the frequency of light waves. It's the brain language your consciousness computes in for the sake of overall processing. And that overall processing is consciousness itself. Our brains map the external world, but they also map their own mapping of self and the external world. So it is an always updating virtual reality mapping system that happens to know it is a mapping system. That's consciousness in a nutshell from my perspective. And qualia is not a magical freeloader on the physical world. It is an intricate expression of various informational realities the brain is actually processing. If it had nothing to do, why would it even be there? How would that make sense from any perspective, much less a supernatural or religious one? But one must be inclined to ask how it can function mechanically, or why we would believe it would do so when obviously we already have a mechanical explanation available in naturalistic terms, because that's what the natural world does. It produces mechanical things. But from my materialistic perspective, qualia has a job. It is a manner of one part of the brain informing another part of the brain what is going on. However, from a non-physicalist perspective, it is a supernatural candy coating to an otherwise perfectly good biological processing machine. So if supernaturalists think the dualist version of qualia has a logistical job to do in mental life, how plausible is it that our brains are the most sophisticated computing machines that we know of in the entire realm of human existence? And yet it still takes magic to get the job done. Why can't magic do the entire job? Why all the elaborate biomechanical machinery everyone agrees is there, and yet we still have a little magical gnome, an inner gremlin or homunculus in charge? As I said, many religious philosophers want to say that since our minds are at least partly non-physical, this is proof of concept for an all non-physical God. Well, if this God doesn't need all this hardware, why do we? From a naturalistic perspective, we have to have all these inordinate mechanics to get the job done. This should count for something, even if supernaturalism can simply accommodate any situation with ad hoc excuses, like a creator's arbitrary preferences, that we have no means of verifying. Qualia is probably sophisticated biological computation that is unrecognizable as such at our level of awareness because of how sophisticated it is. As an analogy to explain the disconnect for a lot of people that have dualist intuitions, if large boulders represent obvious, clunky, materialistic stuff of the world that is easy to identify as material, and smaller rocks represent more complicated arrangements of matter that embody sophisticated and counterintuitive rules and properties, like iPhones that would seem like magic bricks to primitive people, then qualia is about the level of extremely fine-grained sand where you can't even hold a single grain between your fingers and notice that it's there. So imagine an image of a perfect circle. What happens when you zoom in, especially if it's a JPEG image? Well, it's actually all a bunch of squares. Well, how did that happen? How can lots of squares be hiding some kind of circle property? And just to be fair, let's reverse it. Imagine a perfect square, and zoom in on that JPEG, and, well, not necessarily JPEG, or a painting, and surprise, pointillism. Do circles secretly have hidden squarular properties, and squares secretly have hidden circular properties? Or might the special arrangement of material things matter at different levels and exude entirely different properties? So the standard model is a fairly decent-sized equation that can still fit in readable form on the front of a t-shirt. Unfortunately, I didn't have a t-shirt like that to show off there. If something exists in this physical universe, those sets of equations, for all intents and purposes, should be able to explain it, according to naturalism. So according to dualists, qualia cannot be found here. If we look at the periodic table, we do not find mentalium, thoughtium, free willium, moralium, or anything like that. And so hidden in the equations is the entire physical construction of everything in this room. But do you think you could find it? Where's your laptop? Where's your right foot? It would be very difficult to show someone any of these things if we were looking at a bunch of all-encompassing equations. So qualia may seem non-physical, whatever that would mean, but appearances can be deceiving. It seems like it is not a valid argument, and it is at the very least a woefully incomplete inference. But there are other competing naturalistic inferences here, and some with a lot of evidence and a track record of success rather than disconfirmation supernatural inferences have always faced. So if you strip down piece by piece any complex machine, you'll have a simpler and simpler machines until things unravel to brute physical laws they are all ultimately based on. And if we take a look back at that process, we would notice that every level of organization and reorganization was different. They each appeared to have entirely different properties and rules that govern them that have almost nothing to do with the standard model. And it was always physical all the way down, and the apparent changes were always the result of the special arrangement of underlying physical elements. Every level could be described in terms of pure physics if you had nothing better to do with the rest of your life, but it's a huge hassle to do so. So when we turn to consciousness and qualia, it is a perfectly viable hypothesis, at the very least a competitive one, that the experience of ourselves is actually the result of the most sophisticated version of physical rule arrangement that we know of in this universe. So when we think, we shouldn't expect to see atoms floating around. Computers process things just fine without having to have the atomic theory with electrons programmed into their actual calculations, even though deep down inside, their ones and zeros are actually the flow or lack thereof of those electrons. Programs running on your computer start at the relative level they're at and do the job they can do at their level. So our minds start at the most sophisticated level of physicality there is, and it will seem as though every identifiable property at the end result simply has nothing to do with our immediate impression of the standard model or the material world in general as we experience it.